So welcome everybody, and thanks very much for attending this third in a, I wouldn't say a series, but it's turning out to be a series if you connect the dots, Sea Otter Science Symposiums. And we're thrilled to have a 3-day event here focused on the science of sea otters off the Oregon coast and our feasibility study. I want to give a quick shout out to our funders that make both the Elakha Alliance possible, but more specifically the feasibility study. The Meyer Memorial Trust, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Oregon Zoo Foundation, and the Oregon Ocean Conservation Fund that is through the Oregon Community Foundation, Collins Foundation, and many, many generous individual donations. It's true, we could not do it without you. So I'm Bob Bailey. I'm the board president of the Elakha Alliance. We are a nonprofit based in Oregon. We're seeking to improve the diversity, resilience, and productivity of nearshore and estuarine ecosystems by restoring sea otters to Oregon. We're committed to a sound science as a basis for restoring sea otters. We want to understand and avoid or minimize impacts on other ocean users. And we also want to draw lessons from elsewhere about the effects of sea otters on ecosystem and coastal communities. Today and tomorrow and Thursday, our focus here on the symposium is on our sea otter reintroduction draft feasibility study. We'll talk much more about that, but this has been a huge effort over the last year and a half that's resulted in this draft document. You can read it chapter by chapter. If you don't want to dive too deeply into it, although I recommend that, you can read chapter summaries that are available all on our website. So either copy this or just Google Elakha Alliance, it'll pop right up. Go to feasibility study. You can leave comments. We've got a comment form for you to leave comments. If you want to contact us with more substantive comments later after you read the draft and digest it, please get a hold of us. But we'd like those comments by November 30th, please, and then we'll get them back to the team that assembled this thing. We'll make some necessary adjustments, and we hope to have a final document by January. Before we go any further, I want to acknowledge two people who are dear to my heart and essential to the Elakha Alliance. The first is Dave Hatch. Dave passed away a few years ago. He was really the person, the genesis of this idea that sea otters belong in Oregon and that their absence has huge effects, profound effects, both on the ecology of the nearshore environment in the Oregon coast, as well as a huge impact on the culture of Native people along the Oregon coast and beyond. Dave, I'm proud to say his son Peter now serves on our board, but Dave was a huge inspiration to all of us, and we acknowledge him today. Likewise, I want to acknowledge Chief Don Ivey. Don was really my North Star on thinking about reforming the Elakha Alliance in the 2017 and 18. Don recently passed away. Don was our board vice president and a real leader, thought leader in how we approach this whole topic. So I want to acknowledge Don today. And I also want to send good vibes to Jim Estes. Jim, of course, many, if not all of you know Jim, know who he is. Jim was severely injured in an accident back at the end of July. He's on the road to recovery, but it's going to take a long time. If you have not read Jim's book, Serendipity, I encourage you to do so. It's a terrific read, A, and B, it really gives you an idea over the arc of his life and the geography within which he did his research, a lot deeper understanding about sea otters and their role in the world. This is an amazing animal, and Jim has really helped all of us to illuminate that topic. He's been a real friend to our effort here and a member of our science team that wrote the feasibility study. So we're sending good vibes to Jim. Just quickly, we've got the agenda for the next couple of days. Here today we've got 4 speakers this afternoon. We're going to get us started on understanding what's in the feasibility study and some of the issues around that. This evening, I encourage you to come back at 7 o'clock for a really terrific little program. We did a webinar a month and a half or so ago with these 3, and I was just knocked out by it. Different perspectives, different takes on the magic and majesty of kelp forests. And I think you will really enjoy their presentation. So I commend that to you. Tomorrow, again, we're back with 4 presentations in the afternoon, going to go a little bit beyond what's in the feasibility study to a couple of issues that are implicated by it. And one is Sal Jorgensen's talk on great white sharks as a potential wild card in sea otter restoration in Oregon, and Alan Shank's discussion of the Dungeness crab and their life history and considerations for sea otters in Oregon. So tomorrow's going to be a full afternoon, and then we'll wrap it up on Thursday with Sean, Jan Hodder, and Tim is going to come back to reprise a presentation, but a really key presentation. He's going to be walking us through his Oregon sea otter population model that's been central to some of our thinking about next steps beyond the feasibility study. So that's our schedule, and we're going to stick to it. Today, Tuesday, we're going to go through these 4 speakers. So I'm going to I guess we're just about ready to rock and roll here with timing, and I'm going to give a minute or 2 for other people to join, but I'm going to roll to the next slide, Chanel. That'll be the title slide for Tim's talk. So thank you, everybody, for attending. I know it's early in the morning for some of you on the Pacific Rim, Bering Island off Kamchatka and Hokkaido in Japan. It's midnight or just after in Abu Dhabi for some of you, and other times around the world in Canada and the UK. So I appreciate everybody tuning in, and I hope it's worth your while. And thank you. So Tim, anytime you're ready, or Chanel, will you want to direct traffic on that and get him going whenever he's ready?
Okay, excellent. I can share screen anytime. Just let me know when I should start.
Sure, Tim, we'll have you start exactly at 1:30, so you've got 2 minutes. So if people are joining in just to watch you, we'll let them get here at the appropriate time.
Sounds good.
And if anyone has questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A feature for Zoom, which should be on the bottom of your screen there. And we will get to everyone's questions at the end of all the presentations, so all the speakers will be available to answer questions. Thanks so much for joining us. All right, take it away, Tim.
All right. Well, good afternoon, evening, or morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us here today. My role in this is to really kick things off with a really broad overview of the feasibility study for the reintroduction of sea otters to Oregon. I'm going to cover at sort of a very high altitude some of the topics and chapters that went into this study, but then I'm going to turn it over to my erstwhile colleagues who will really dig into the meat of things and get into the details. So for starters, why even consider reintroduction of sea otters to Oregon? What was in fact the motivation for this feasibility study? There are, in fact, probably as many reasons to consider this as there are people, but at least in terms of the Elakha Alliance, there are really sort of four broad categories of motivating factors or considerations. And probably first and foremost of these was the idea of restoring various ecological functions of sea otters, which are keystone species in the North Pacific coastal ecosystems where they do occur. Those ecological functions performed by sea otters were removed over much of the Northeast Pacific at the end of the 19th century or the 18th and 19th century because of the fur trade, and the sea otters were driven to extinction. And so those roles have been absent for a long time in a lot of places. But as sea otters have recovered over parts of their former range, those ecological functions have been restored. And that has not happened in Oregon to this point. So that was one of the considerations. Another consideration is the idea of restoring the deeply rooted cultural links between sea otters and human residences. And in fact, that was, I think, a lot of the motivation of David Hatch and others at the beginning of the Elakha Alliance. And it's something that really it's hard to sort of quantify, but it's extremely important to a lot of people. So that was another one of the motivating factors. Another one of the motivating factors is the idea of increasing the capacity for sea otters species overall to survive potentially catastrophic events. Some of the catastrophic events that affect sea otters most intensely are oil spills, and there have been several of those that have had huge impacts to sea otter populations in various parts of the range. And that continues to be a threat that could lead large areas to be large areas of the population to be wiped out. But there are, in fact, other catastrophic events, many of which are emerging with a changing climate. So the idea of increasing sort of the resilience of sea otter populations overall by having them in places where they are currently absent. And finally, and this we'll get in one of our speakers coming up, we'll talk about this in more detail, but the idea of improving gene flow between northern sea otters in the Washington and British Columbia coasts and southern sea otters in California. And that gene flow historically occurred because there was a continuous distribution, but that there's been a break in that gene flow because of the lack of sea otters in the Oregon coast. So those are some of the factors for why we might consider reintroducing sea otters to Oregon. But that then leads to this feasibility study. Is it in fact even feasible? So the overall goals and objectives of the feasibility study are as follows. And obviously to assess the relative feasibility of a reintroduction of sea otters to the coast of Oregon in consideration of several categories of important factors. First of these are the implications for the viability of populations, of sea otter populations. That includes both the source populations from which sea otters might be removed for reintroduction, and then any new populations that are established in Oregon. So basic population viability analyses are a core part of any core consideration for any reintroduction. Another key consideration is the suitability of habitat in Oregon and the potential for both positive and negative ecological effects of sea otter recovery to that habitat. Another consideration involves social and economic impacts of the restoration of sea otters to Oregon. And again, these can be both positive from a perspective of people and negative. And the feasibility study is really attempts to delve into all of these types of impacts. And it's definitely not trying to in any way sugarcoat these, because there are some very serious considerations that need to be carefully investigated and discussed broadly amongst a lot of stakeholders and groups of society to make sure that these are well understood. Then there's consideration, another key consideration for feasibility are the administrative and legal requirements. And Michelle Schwartz will be talking about some of those later on today or tomorrow, I think. And then finally, considerations of sort of the practical considerations of logistical constraints. What are the key steps for implementation? So those are the primary goals of the feasibility study. I'm going to now sort of give you a quick overview of what the feasibility study is, and probably just as important, what the feasibility study is not. So what the feasibility study is, or is intended to be, is a resource for community groups, stakeholders, and agencies who may be considering the reintroduction of sea otters to Oregon. We wanted to assemble as much of the science as possible to provide a useful tool, a resource for all of these people to help in consideration of this concept. So it's a compilation of much of the relevant data, published science to help support decision-making. So that's what the feasibility study is. What is it not? It is definitely not intended to be a proposal. And sometimes that can be a little bit of I guess, a fuzzy distinction, but it's a really important one. The feasibility study is not proposing to reintroduce sea otters to Oregon. It's an investigation or a summary of the science that is necessary for considering feasibility. But it is not a proposal. The actual proposal, should that occur, would come later and would be informed by many things, including this feasibility study, we hope. Another thing the feasibility study is not is an attempt to make a case either for or against reintroduction. Many people and many different groups already have opinions one way or another, for or against, and many people and community groups and stakeholders do not yet have not yet formed an opinion, and both of those are fine. It is not the role of the feasibility study to try and convince anyone one way or another, rather, again, to provide all the information necessary for people to make a decision on that for themselves and at the societal level. And finally, it is not intended to be an exhaustive assessment of all possible scenarios or possible outcomes of a reintroduction. We do, in fact, within the feasibility, explore some of these possible scenarios and what we think possible outcomes might be and their implications, but we're not attempting to explore all possible scenarios. That's a more rigorous assessment might come later in the proposal. Okay, so onto the feasibility study itself. The authors of the study were Bob had initially asked me to take this on more than a year ago now, I guess probably a year and a half ago, and it quickly became apparent to me that I was in way over my head. So we broadened the field to include some much more capable co-authors. So in addition to myself, we brought on the following distinguished people. Dr. Jim Estes, from formerly of USGS and now Professor Emeritus at University of California at Santa Cruz. And again, as Bob said, really our thoughts are with Jim right now as he recovers. He worked really hard on this study, as he has in so many other things related to sea otter ecology over his career. So we're looking forward to having him back and hope he continues to make a solid recovery. So Jim made some very important contributions to the feasibility study, as I'll be discussing soon. Dr. Jim Bodkin, also formerly of US Geological Survey, also now retired and emeritus, helped in a number of the different chapters, and he'll be talking actually right after me, I believe. Dr. Sean Larson from the Seattle Aquarium was brought. Sean kindly agreed to help out with some of the various topics that her expertise is in, including both primarily the genetic consideration, but also the history of sea otter recovery in different areas, including the history in Oregon. Dr. Mike Murray, the head of veterinary services at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, was a really key contributor to this. I believe Mike is going to be speaking to us later today, and he took on this really huge category, health and health, sort of a health and risk assessment to address some of the things that affect the health and welfare of sea otters and that need to be considered for any sort of reintroduction. And finally, Dr. Jan Otter from the University of Oregon, Professor Emeritus from the university. Jen was really sort of our local expert on habitat and sort of the coastal ecology of Oregon, since the rest of us were sort of outsiders to Oregon, so to speak. Well, okay, so what goes into a feasibility study? A lot of different things. This is sort of the meat grinder of the feasibility study. And these are broadly speaking, the topics that each of which represents a chapter of the feasibility study. And as Bob mentioned, you can go to the website and delve into each of these chapters in more detail. And over the next couple of days, our speaker is going to be covering most, not all of those. We didn't really have the time to cover everything, but most of these will be covered over the next few days. I'm going to just give you a quick overview now of some of these. So first of all, history of past translocations. This is sort of how the feasibility starts out, and it's a really important topic. And Jim Bodkin is going to be talking to us about this in just a few minutes now. But the idea is translocations have in fact been a really important part of sea otter recovery from the fur trade and of sea otter conservation more broadly. There have been quite a number of different past translocations and reintroductions of sea otters to their historic range over the 20th century. And in fact, those reintroduced populations account for a very large proportion of the world population of sea otters now. So they really have been very successful, although not all of those translocations were successful. And in fact, there were a lot of lessons learned, hard lessons learned over the course of those translocations. So Jim's going to be covering those. The idea is we can learn a lot from what went right and what went wrong, and what were sort of the key takeaway messages from some of those past translocations. So Jim will be distilling that for us. Then from the history of past translocations, we delve into a topic that I have a lot of interest in, which is population biology and demography. I assume all of you know what that equation means. No, I'm just kidding. I don't assume that, but that is in fact sort of the guts of a matrix model that is used to project population dynamics into the future for many different populations. These tools are used, and we develop one of these tools from other sea otter models that have been developed for other areas of this range. We developed one and sort of tailored it specifically for considering a sea otter population reintroduction to Oregon. I'll be talking about this in more detail, I think on Thursday evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on what your time zone is. So I'm not going to talk too much more about this now, except to say that, well, basically just that this is a core consideration. We use quantitative approaches to assess what the viability of reintroduced populations might be, and what factors need to be considered to ensure viability of a population, so that if a reintroduction were to occur, it would not it would succeed and not disappear. But we also need to consider what the population and demographic impacts would be for a source population as well. As part of, I guess, a tool to help us in these considerations, we embedded that population model I just mentioned within a web-based tool that can allow people, even people who don't happen to be population modelers, but do know how to use a website, to essentially explore some of these dynamics themselves using this tool and drop down menu approach to explore, for instance, how changing the number of individuals introduced and where they might be introduced in Oregon might affect the potential outcome. So I'll be talking about this more on Thursday. Another broad category of considerations for feasibility, as mentioned, are genetic and historical considerations. Sean's going to be talking to us about that, I think later today or tomorrow, or maybe Thursday. I don't have the schedule up right now, so I get a bit confused about that. So again, this is sort of really important to consider. What is the deep history of sea otters in Oregon? What do we know about that from from traditional knowledge, from First Nations peoples up through sort of written historical accounts, up to the current time, or up to the time, at least up to the time of the fur trade. So the historical considerations are important for thinking about what we might expect a population in Oregon to look like now or in the future. And then another key consideration here are the genetic considerations. And this is an area that Sean is really one of the world experts on. So she'll be talking to us about those genetic considerations for a reintroduction, sort of the within Oregon considerations, but also the I guess the range-wide considerations and what the significance of a population established in Oregon might be for gene flow up and down the range. Okay, another major set of considerations with a reintroduction of sea otters are ecological considerations. Now, of course, reintroducing any wildlife species to a habitat from which it's been absent for a long time is always going to have ecological effects. And so any reintroduction is going to involve considering what those ecological effects might be and the implications for the people and biological communities that live there. But with sea otters, this is particularly intense, and that's because sea otters are, as we mentioned earlier, keystone species. And a keystone species simply means they have inordinately large impacts relative to their abundance on the functioning and structure of ecosystems in which they occur. And this food web you see in this picture here shows some of those interactions between sea otters and other components of the nearshore coastal ecosystem. And in some of those cases, you see a bunch of bar graphs here, and those show actual data from studies that were conducted of those sort of species in question, and what happened after sea otters were returned, both when sea otters are absent and then when sea otters recover or are reintroduced. How did those things change? And as you can see, for many of them, there were just substantial changes, but there's also some question marks there, and that's because we don't exactly know what might happen with recovery of sea otters, either because there just haven't been studies done, or in some cases because there are studies that have been done and they give conflicting results. So there's a lot we do know, there's a lot we don't know. The one thing we know for sure is that sea otters will have profound and extensive effects on the structure and function of ecosystems. So that is one thing that has been sort of consistent everywhere that sea otters have recovered. So this is really the area of expertise of Jim Estes. He's the world expert in this subject. Jim, as we mentioned, is not able to be with us now as he is recovering. So we've asked another colleague of ours, Dr. Lynn Lee from British Columbia, Canada, who's also an expert in sort of the ecological effects of sea otter recovery, to sort of fill in for us and give us an overview of these ecological effects and what has been found in some other places that sea otters have recovered. So Lynn will be talking to us, I think, tomorrow. Another broad set of considerations include the effects on habitat or the habitat needs of sea otters and what that looks like in Oregon. Jan Otter, as mentioned, is our local expert on the habitats of coastal Oregon. So she is going to be talking to us and providing a sort of an overview and actually in some cases a deep dive into variation in habitat types, things like kelp forests, sandy beaches of the outer coast, and then estuaries, all places where sea otters can occur. What do we know about those habitats, and what types of habitats are going to be most successful at supporting sea otters potentially in the future, and what might be the effects of sea otters on those habitats. Which leads us into this broad category of socioeconomic considerations. So I mentioned that sea otters are keystone species, and that means they have these profound effects on coastal ecosystems. And of course, people also occur in those coastal ecosystems. So when things change in those systems, that affects people, real communities. And so this is a subject that we have tried to pay a lot of attention to in the feasibility study, although we realize and recognize that we're really just addressing the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot of work still to be done in understanding and preparing for these sorts of socioeconomic impacts that might be associated with sea otter recovery. Some of those impacts are positive, and some of those impacts are negative, depending on sort of the groups involved. And so in all cases, they're complex and they're complicated. So it's there's no simple right or wrong answer to any of these, but there is a lot of information that does exist from other areas that otters have recovered, and we're trying to build on that as much as we can to hopefully anticipate what some of the changes might be involved and what that might look like in Oregon coastal habitats. The next subject, sort of built from the socioeconomic, are the legal and regulatory considerations. There are a lot of different laws and regulations that apply to sea otters, or that must be accounted for when considering a reintroduction of sea otters anywhere, but including coastal Oregon. When I start to delve into those, I sort of feel the same way that the sea otter looks. I scratch my head and well, scream really, but that's luckily I don't have to present this to you because we have one of the experts on this, Michelle Zwartjes from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who will be walking us through in a very careful way all these different laws and regulations and making sense of them for us, so we won't feel like the sea otter here. Another category of considerations that are covered in the feasibility study. We don't have a specific presenter to talk about these, although I think Jim might touch on some of those in his talk today, but these are the implementation and logistics considerations. How does one go about reintroducing sea otters to a habitat? There's a lot of steps involved and a lot of things that need to be thought of before, during, and after a reintroduction occurs. Everything from, well, from pre-monitoring of the ecosystem long before any otters are actually introduced to it, to get an idea of what baseline conditions look like, up through the actual mechanics of capturing, moving, and reintroducing sea otters, and then finally through to the post-release monitoring and activities that occur after sea otters have been reintroduced to a new area. So there's a lot involved here, and this is a pretty long chapter, so I would definitely invite you to go and check that out, have a look at the summary on the web, and maybe delve into the actual chapter. And then another huge category of considerations are animal health and welfare considerations. And luckily, we're really lucky to have Dr. Mike Murray from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, who's really the world expert, the foremost expert on sea otter health worldwide. Mike kindly took on the challenge of drafting this chapter and assembling the vast array of literature that's out there on sea otter health and welfare considerations. So it's another pretty massive chapter, but hopefully Mike will sort of be able to distill it down for us today and make sense of it. Because there are a lot of things that affect sea otter health and that will be relevant for considering in the case of an Oregon population. So that's just as mentioned, a super high altitude flyover of all the different topics that are in the feasibility study. Our broad takeaway messages from the study are that we don't see, that is the co-authors of the study, any insurmountable barriers to a reintroduction of sea otters to Oregon being feasible and potentially successful should it occur. However, there's a pretty long list of caveats. And ultimately, feasibility is going to depend on attention to all of the different considerations that I've just mentioned and given you a super fast walkthrough. Failing to consider any one of these, whether it's the ecological effects or the socioeconomic impacts, could really compromise the success or the feasibility of any sort of reintroduction of sea otters. So we encourage those who will be considering reintroduction and ultimately those who will be making decisions to really pay attention to all of these factors. That means we encourage all of you who are listening today. I hope that you will enjoy the presentations that you're going to see over the next few days, and will give you a sense of both the complexity and the possibilities of a reintroduction of sea otters to Oregon. So thank you very much. And I think we're going to hold questions for the end of the session. So